Coming up, it's time to talk about Old Reliable. Okay, not that Old Reliable, although some additions have been made. No, we're talking about CSX's Georgia Railroad Heritage Unit. But has something been left off this thing? We're going to talk about that, and of course, we're going back in time. Plus, was there an unofficial Georgia Railroad Heritage Unit a few years ago? All that and more is next. Fairburn, Georgia, home to a massive CSX intermodal terminal. And today, it's a stop for CSX train I-198 as it heads south. In the lead, number 1834, the Georgia Railroad Heritage Unit, still looking fresh on this hot July day after its debut in June of 2024. By now, many of you probably know the complaint many rail fans have about CSX's heritage units. Head on, they look like any other CSX locomotive because the railroad decided to paint only 3/4 of their special engines in heritage colors. It's hard not to question why CSX made this choice. Norfolk Southern has 20 units that are fully painted and based on historic predecessor railroad paint schemes. And before those were done, Union Pacific painted several units in what I would describe as a modern take on the historic railroads that it had acquired over the years. Unveiled in 2006, UP 1996 honors Southern Pacific. I suppose you could argue that the average person who sees fully painted heritage units like these might not connect them with UP or NS. Obviously, the CSX units don't have this problem. Their branding is front and center. Okay, so aside from the front of the locomotive, which wears CSX's default dark blue and yellow, the Georgia Road paint scheme seems pretty accurate. In fact, according to a video CSX posted when they debuted this machine, painters had to use a special zigzag technique when applying the metallic colors. And while the paint job is superb, something is missing. Specifically this, the Georgia Railroad Herald, applied to the back of the engine but not the sides. Take a look at this photo from 1963. Although faded, you can see the Herald is applied to the sides of the engine on the front and back. I suppose I can also counter my own argument here by showing you that the railroad's FP7s did not have the Herald on the sides, but the hood units certainly did. Now, if you want to study this paint scheme a little more, head over to the Southeastern Railway Museum in Duluth, Georgia. There, you'll find number 1026, an electromotive division GP7 built in 1950. A little bit faded, but it's probably the best example of a fully painted Georgia Railroad engine in 2024. Now, let's be honest. Us rail fans can be pretty critical of how our favorite railroads are represented in the 21st century. In the end, this is just painted metal, right? Honestly, I'm just happy CSX is doing something to honor its history. This critique should not diminish the hard work put in by the folks down in Waycross, Georgia who paint these things. So what makes this railroad so important, at least to me, is its deep connection to Georgia and more specifically Atlanta history. The company was chartered in 1833 and in 1835 the railroad expanded into the banking business. The Georgia Road was then referred to as the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company. By 1845, tracks had been laid from Augusta to Atlanta, then known as Terminus and later Marthasville. According to the book A History of Georgia Railroads by Robert C. Jones, legend has it that John Edgar Thompson, the chief engineer in charge of building the railroad, decided to rename Marthasville Atlanta, apparently because Marthasville was just too long for railroad paperwork. In Atlanta, the Georgia Railroad linked up with the Western and Atlantic, which went to Chattanooga, and the two lines are still connected. Under the city streets, you can find the Zero Milepost. Well, this is actually a replica. The real thing is at the Atlanta History Center. Anyway, the Zero Milepost marked the terminus of the W&A, basically establishing what we now know as Atlanta. Now, the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company's history had some ups and downs. Like many Southern industries, it was devastated by the Civil War. As you might have guessed, it was rebuilt, but the evolution of ownership and operation of the Georgia Railroad is complicated. The major players included the Louisville and Nashville and Atlantic coastline, then the Seaboard coastline and the Family Line system, and later the Seaboard system and finally CSX. The Georgia Railroad was also closely intertwined with the Atlanta and West Point and Western Railway of Alabama, those two being known as the West Point route. For years, both passengers and freight traveled up and down the Georgia Road. In fact, the railroad was one of the last companies in the continental U.S. to do both, likely because their charter with the state legislature called for passenger service. And by the way, it was common to see Atlanta and West Point and Western Railway of Alabama locomotives pulling Georgia Railroad trains. This was quite an interesting operation. How about this old boxcar converted into a caboose? Anyway, some of the final passenger services the company offered were on so-called mixed trains, hauling both freight and passengers. That all came to an end in 1983. Here's a shot from 1963 of a Georgia Railroad passenger train at Atlanta's now long-gone Union Station. Aside from MARTA, passenger trains don't stop downtown anymore, but there's still plenty of Georgia Railroad history here and around the metro area. In 1869, construction on the Georgia Railroad Freight Depot was completed. It's now one of the oldest, if not the oldest building in downtown Atlanta. Part of the building was once 3 stories high, but a fire in 1935 resulted in what we see today. For those of you who have visited Atlanta, you may remember the World of Coke being next door. That attraction moved several years ago, but the old building's foundation still remains. And around 6 miles to the east in Decatur, another Georgia Railroad depot still stands, although CSX wanted it moved back away from the right-of-way. The building is now a restaurant. Here's a shot of the depot from back in 1963. The switcher is an electromotive division NW2. And here's a wider angle. Man, has this area changed. Steps away from the old depot, a bridge that still says Georgia Railroad. Continuing to the east, the line passes the iconic Stone Mountain. The tracks around the mountain were once connected to the Georgia Road, but that connection has since been severed. That's right, the Stone Mountain Scenic Railroad and its classic locomotives are now cut off from the outside world. Heading farther east to Lithonia, there's a small yard. That's where I saw this back in 2022. Yeah, a GP40-3 with the Georgia Railroad Herald on the side, along with some other unusual details. And I'm not quite sure who applied these Georgia Road decals. Not far away in Conyers, more signs of the Georgia Railroad. The historic depot still stands here, along with reminders of recent CSX history. Moving farther east is this coaling tower in Social Circle, Georgia. Of course, these were used in the days of steam to top off a locomotive's tender. This one was likely built sometime in the 1910s or early 1920s. But sadly, it was demolished in 2022. Winding down our look at Georgia Railroad landmarks, things get interesting in Madison. The Georgia Road and former Central Georgia tracks run side by side here. Here's a picture taken in the Madison area from 1967. In this 6-engine lash-up, high-hood Jeeps, and 2 EMD F units. Oh, and the Madison Depot, yep, it's still here. As the sign says, this was the first brick station in Georgia. These days, the Cater Parrot operates the Central Georgia tracks next door. So, what's the Georgia Railroad like now? Well, the line from Atlanta to Augusta is still operated by CSX, although it doesn't see lots of traffic. Mostly just locals, but the track appears to be well maintained, and as you can see, it can definitely handle those long, modern freight trains. Now, most of CSX traffic going northeast seems to go via the Abbeville subdivision, which is ex-Seaboard Airline. It's hard to say what'll happen to the Georgia Road. Maybe CSX will hold on to it. It's certainly a good thing to have when you need to reroute trains if there's a problem somewhere else on the CSX system. Of course, a short line could also take over from CSX. We'll see. Regardless, lots of Georgia Railroad history still remains, and while in my humble opinion the Heritage Unit isn't perfect, I'd really like to see those decals applied to the sides. In the end, at least CSX is honoring a small railroad that was a big part of Georgia history. Anyway, that's it for now. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.